At 11 o'clock, the chandeliers turned traitors. Their crystal teeth refracted everyone's faces into shards. Smiles stretched thin, painted laughter, and a bride in a dress that suddenly felt like armor. Qin Xi stood at the edge of the dais, the hem of her gown iced in scattered rice, and watched the world she had rehearsed for years fold inward on itself. Her fiancé, Zhao Zhenan, was supposed to be the comfortable center of that world, a steady hand, a familial alliance, the public proof her family had not misstepped when they arranged the engagement. Tonight, he was not steady. He was a lie, found in the most obscene way, a video taken from a balcony, pinging through phones like a virus. On the screen, captured with merciless clarity, Zhao Zhenan's mouth met another woman's where it shouldn't. Laughter from the crowd snapped and frayed. Phones rose like a second gallery. Someone hissed. The banquet music faltered, then collapsed into a scattered murmur. Qin Xi felt the first hot twist of humiliation like a physical thing, hot and salt and impossibly sharp. She could have fled. She could have gathered herself, measured the damage, let the family fix the optics. That was the pragmatic thing to do, the thing a Qin daughter would do. Instead, her mouth moved before her brain caught up. She walked straight toward the projection screen where that grainy betrayal played on loop. Her voice cut through the motion like a blade. "Stop it." Silence didn't come. People recorded, speculated, laughed. Someone shouted that she should make a public scene. People always demanded spectacle, so she gave it to them. "You promised me a life," Qin Xi told Zhao Zhenan, in front of all these witnesses. She kept her voice level, which made the words colder. "You promised you would be faithful." He stood there, the color drained from him like a ghost that had been living on borrowed light. Guests shifted. A chair screeched as someone stood. Her mother's fingers curled white around the back of a seat. Qin Xi, the half-sister, with a smile that could be used as currency, hovered near the cake table as though a scandal was nothing but a seasonal decoration. There was a thin, bivalent thrill to seeing how fast the social engine could pivot from celebration to carnage. Zhao Zhenan stammered explanations, accidents, misunderstandings, a failed joke, or perhaps a well-practiced apology that meant nothing. The crowd wanted the fireworks. He gave them none. He tried to come forward, to do the right thing socially, to bow, to own, to be contrite. Instead, he betrayed a deeper shame. He pretended she was the one betraying him. "Are you going to make a scene? Is this what you want?" Qin Xi laughed then, a short, incredulous sound that did more damage than any thrown glass. She took the microphone from the MC as if it were a weapon and held it like a declaration. "I don't want to be married to a man who needs an audience to tell the truth," she said, "so I won't." Lights stung at the edges of her vision. Cameras fed images back to 1,000 decades of expectation. To leave the marriage, publicly, was a kind of revolt that had nothing to do with love anymore. It was an erasure of every plan they'd mapped out for her. Her father's face went slate. Someone hissed. Qin Xi's eyes glittered, not with pity, but with opportunity. It should have been the end. But then the glass in the room settled into its next reflection. A man at the edge of the corridor, coal dark hair cut severe, shoulders wrapped in a coat that cost more than some guests' cars. He was watching with cool interest, hands in his pockets, a figure who didn't look like he belonged at a family war. Bo Yi. No one had announced him. He hadn't been expected. He had the sort of look that made you feel seen without being warmed. His presence rearranged the air like a hand drawing a line across a map. He watched her speak, watched how she dismantled the facade, and when the applause of disapproval started, he walked forward. There was a brief, private exchange that looked almost comic from the dais. He leaned over the balustrade and said something to one of her uncles, a whisper that moved through the family like a cold draft. Then he crossed the floor and stopped in front of Qin Xi. The crowd hushed, not out of politeness, but because the room senses a pivot. "You two can stop pretending," he said, in a voice that was both clear and neutral. He did not smile. "Miss Qin, accept his betrayal and save yourself the trouble, or accept mine." A laugh cut through the room. A few guests clucked. Bo Yi's voice was a blade wrapped in velvet. No one had an immediate counter. He took off his gloves, slid a hand from his coat, and extended it with a formal, absurd gesture. "Marry me," he said. For a beat, Qin Xi thought it was a joke. People around them mistook it for an eccentric stunt, botched chivalry. But his eyes were serious. The man was not proposing in tenderness. He was proposing in calculation, in a social chess move so large it stunned the tablecloth-draped world. "Why would I marry you?" she asked. The word "you" on her lips tasted like defiance. He looked at her as if he weighed her value in truths. "Because it will neutralize his lie. Because it will stop your family from being dragged through gossip. Because you can play the part for a year. Because I can give you a deal." People whispered. The room recalibrated. It is hard to describe how power feels until you are offered a lifeline that is also a lock. Qin Xi's family stared at her as though she had become a possession on auction. She felt the press of their expectations like a physical weight. "What's your price?" she asked, dry as tinder. Bo Yi produced a slim folder, no fanfare, handed it to the family liaison who had approached him seconds before, and watched as it passed like contraband. Inside, a draft prenup, a short, pointed term sheet. 1 year. Social duties. In the back of Qin Xi's mind, the promissory thing about the marriage, its cold, protective logic, began to look less like a contract and more like a shield. The hospital smelled like bleach and fear. Qin Goyu, her grandfather's name, was the axis of her childhood. He was the man who told her stories about a shop that became an industry, who had a chuckle that softened the sharper corners of the house. In the engine of family power, he was both conscience and architect. To see him splayed on a gurney, eyes half closed, the pale bloom of someone who had been robbed of breath, was to watch an entire history teeter. Bo Yi moved like he knew exactly what needed to be done. He found the ER director with the kind of ease that comes from buying the hospital's expansion plans. He demanded priority. He didn't argue. He offered resources, a call he would make, a specialist he could pull. Technical competence wrapped around the emergency like an anesthetic. Qin Xi wanted to stop him, wanted to assert that the family would insist on its own. But when the attending physician asked if they could get a consult with a vascular surgeon, Bo Yi had already spoken into his earpiece and secured the right man. The operating room was an odd kind of theater. Monitors breathed. Fluorescent lights made everything too detailed. Sweat halos, the thin blue lines of veins mapped under skin, the precise hum of machines that measure the body's small betrayals. Qin Xi stood in the waiting room with hands clasped so tightly her knuckles went white. Her chest felt raw with guilt. Her wedding had been the argument that yanked the carpet out from under her family. If this were punishment, it was efficient. Bo Yi remained near the head nurse's station, quiet as a sentinel. He kept his coat off and folded it on the back of a chair. He did not, utterly, strikingly, ask for gratitude. He had offered the contract. He had offered a sanctuary from public shame. Each of those things was a decision. He did not seek to be thanked for the rest, but he also did not exempt himself from being useful. When the surgeon came out, hair damp, masked jaw set like a hinge, Bo Yi stepped forward and listened. The surgeon's words were compressed and precise. "He's elderly," she said, "hypertensive. He had a hemorrhagic event. We'll have to go in, evacuate the clot. There's a chance we can stabilize him, but the risks are substantial. Qin Xi felt as if someone had telescoped the hallway. A line of images, test results, flew through her head. Bo Yi's face, the registrar stamp, the social media headlines. He put a palm on her shoulder in a gesture that was neither intimate nor distant, but whatever strange third thing it was, it held her. Her breath shook. She wanted to recoil from the man who had become her charade-in-law 24 hours ago. Instead, she turned to him and allowed the contact. Hours became an elastic thing. Nurses moved like coordinated instruments. Machines made their quiet music. At one point, she drifted to the window and pressed a hand against the cool glass and felt dizzy with the smallness of her problems, the betrayal, the arrangement, the future. Those concerns were tiny next to someone who might not wake up. She remembered a phrase from childhood, that the Qin bloodline was durable, built, her grandfather used to say, on endurance as much as on cunning. The thought steadied her. She sat in the plastic chair with its punctured armrest and thought of every story her grandfather had told her, as if lining up for evidence. When the surgeon finally came out, she was tired and precise and unromantic about miracles. "The procedure went well," she said. "He's in ICU. He's stable for now, but we'll need to run a full battery of tests. We need to be sure we understand what triggered the hemorrhage." Qin Xi let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. She slumped, relief momentarily unclenched into something near tears. It was then that the surgeon added, casually, like an aside to a colleague, "There are some oddities in the meds administered earlier." The statement lodged like a splinter. "What oddities?" Qin Xi asked, voice thin and immediate. The surgeon's eyes flicked toward Bo Yi. He had been standing there, silent, composed, and his profile saw everything like a low shutter closing. "Some doses don't match the chart. We'll need to reconcile pharmacy logs with nursing notes. Could be a reconciliation error. Could be contamination. We'll know when we run the tests." Outside the ICU, the hospital compressed into a pressure cooker. Bits of life had been suspended in antiseptic plastic, a grandmother facilitating phone calls, a cousin kneeling for religious consolation, a family lawyer on a folding chair with a notepad. Someone muttered about a leaked video, how it had pushed everything else into a footnote. But the surgeon's oddity murmured along into the fabric of the night and put a different word on the problem: suspicion. Bo Yi took control with the same economy he used at the registry. He asked, quietly, efficiently, for copies of medication logs, for access to the pharmacy CCTV, for the chain of custody of substances that had been administered in the ward. Nurses looked at him with a blend of gratitude and discomfort. Hospitals have rules. Power bends rules. "You could leave," someone said to him at one point, an old hospital volunteer who had been there for 30 years. "You didn't owe them this." Bo Yi's reply was clean. "I have an interest in the facts." He stayed. He moved like a man who had found a new category of obligation. He did not invent intimacy. He manufactured competence. When dawn came up pale and thin across the parking lot, Qin Xi found herself in a corner of the ICU, the beeping of monitors like a lullaby of modern saints. Her grandfather breathed, controlled by machines and more willpower than lucidity. His fingers twitched. She watched the slow, regulated rise of his chest and felt a small, primitive joy. Someone, one of the nurses, a young man with a tired smile, brought a thermos of tea. Bo Yi accepted a cup and handed the hot ceramic to her. She took it and felt the heat sink into her palms. It grounded her in a way the prenup never could. They talked, briefly, in the dull lull between shifts. It was not a confessional. It was a moment composed of small human things. A confession that he had not intended to be at the wedding. An acknowledgement that the arrangement had been practical. He told her, without flourish, that sometimes the world needed a tidy answer, and he liked tidy answers. "You expect me to be grateful," she said, half smiling. "I don't expect anything," he answered, "except that you behave as if the arrangement is what it is." "Which is?" she prodded. "A temporal shield." He leaned back, eyes on the bleary window. 1 year. Legal language. Social performance. No entanglement. And yet he had stayed. He had brought a surgeon. He had engaged the hospital's best team. He had asked for medlogs. He had sat through the hours. Actions accumulate. Often they outpace intentions. Qin Xi felt the first shift, subtle and disorienting. A thaw, like the slow melt of a winter she hadn't thought would end. A nurse returned with a file. The hospital technician, newer, eager, had printed out a preliminary reconciliation of meds. The list read like bureaucratic poetry. Timestamps, initials, batch numbers, and a curious, small, maddening discrepancy. A bottle of sedative had been listed as administered at 10:42 p.m., a time when only one particular nurse had logged in. But the vial's batch number didn't match the dispensary inventory. The technician pointed this out with an apologetic pride, like one already expecting to be wrong. Bo Yi's eyes narrowed in a way that made the room colder. He reached for the file, his fingers reading the numbers like a man fluent in fiscal ledgers. "Chain of custody," he murmured. "We need CCTV from the ward, inventory reconciliation, and the pharmacy shipping logs." The nurse produced a flurry of notes. The technician scrolled through CCTV archives and froze the image. It was grainy, time-stamped, a nurse moving down the corridor in a pale blue scrub. Her silhouette passed a supply closet where a figure lingered, blurred, too blurred. Then the feed cut. The hospital CCTV had gaps in it, lapses of 15 minutes, as if the footage had been edited. Bo Yi didn't announce the conclusion he was forming. He lined up the evidence as if stacking chips. "Run a full toxicology," he said. "Trace the batch, lock the supply room." Qin Xi's stomach turned. The implication was a slow poison, and not only in glycerin and saline. There was a different, sharper kind of betrayal that crept into a house and rearranged its architecture from the inside. Her chest tightened. That her grandfather had collapsed in the wake of her wedding, a time when the family met and quarreled and displayed its seams, suddenly felt less a coincidence and more contact with a design. In the corridor, phones chimed. Reporters smelled blood in the water of scandal and began to circle for quotes. Someone from Qin Xi's side tried to manage the narrative. Friendlies paid to smile, a statement drafted to the public explaining an unexpected medical emergency. Social media filled with euphemisms and hashtags. But in the ICU, the enough to find center of real consequence, the language became narrower. Tests, logs, batch numbers. As dawn became morning, the lights inside the hospital, clear and clinical, Bo Yi stepped outside into a puff of air. He made a call, terse words to an associate, a few questions that demanded answers, names of labs he trusted, references that fit like keys. The rest of the family moved through the hospital like ghosts. They called lawyers, they arranged condolences for the cameras, they whispered about wills and succession like vultures. Qin Xi lingered by the coffee machine, her lips tight with something cynical. Qin Xi watched all of it, the pretense, the opportunism, the terrified, greedy family machinery. She felt a wariness settle over her. The contract had been written to provide social cover. She had not anticipated that it might also tether a man who could move across bureaucracies with a flick of his wrist. "Stay until we know more," Bo Yi said suddenly, as if reading her mind. There was no command in the words, only an assessment. She sat in the chair and nodded. Watching him, She realized the contract was morphing into a new kind of arrangement, one where protection came with conditions, where loyalty was measured in tactical moves. She did not know if she trusted him. She did not know if she wanted to. But she did know that every other person in the room was either cowardly or predatory, or both. An hour later, after the first battery of tests and CT scans, a lab tech appeared with a thin face and bright, exhausted eyes. He had flagged a callus of numbers. Preliminary, he cautioned. We'll have full toxicology within 24 hours, but there is an anomaly in the serum. It's faint. It could be contamination. It could be a metabolite. We can't say for certain yet. Those hedges were a lifeline and an insult all at once. The nurse folded the paper into a neat rectangle and handed it to Qin Xi. The numbers looked like a foreign language. She read nothing, but the text sounded like a confirmation of the hunch that had lit in her chest. Something had been done. Bo Yi read it too, and his jaw worked. In the gap between her family's whispering, scheming, and the stoic sanitation of the hospital, the two of them inhabited a narrow island. He was reserved, strategic, and impatient with theatrics. She was raw, infuriated, and furious with the surgery of her own life. If a marriage could be a shield, then the man who offered it was the person wielding it. For the first time since the wedding, Qin Xi felt the initial awkward shape of something that could be closer to trust than she'd expected, an alliance born not of romance but of necessity, slowly birthing something else. A message lit his phone. He read it, eyes folding into a small frown. Then he looked up and said, for the first time in a tone that was not performance, I want my team to run the chain of custody for the meds. If there was tampering, we'll find it. In the glare of that moment, she thought of her grandfather's hands, calloused from decades, and how much of an empire could hinge on a single vial administered at the wrong time. She thought of Qin Xi's smile as another kind of proof that enemies could wear the face of family. There was no heroic crescendo. The ICU was only one place where the drama would unfold, but the seed had been planted. The marriage they had signed a few hours earlier, an instrument meant to cover a scandal, was already being repurposed into a working partnership. They were partners in a new sense, in crisis and in evidence, in proximity and in purpose. A reporter's camera flashed on the sidewalk below, catching a mirror image of two people who had promised to each other nothing more than convenience. The image would run across feeds with headlines about a whirlwind wedding and a mystery hospital stay. The world would love its tidy narratives, humiliations and rescues, the rise of a noble CEO, the fall of unscrupulous relatives. But within the white noise of social appetite lay a narrower, more corrosive danger, the deliberate tampering of things meant to sustain life. When the lab tech called their attention to one point in particular, everyone fell silent. The sample taken from Qin Goyu showed trace levels of a sedative that ought not to have been present at that concentration. The lab could not yet say whether the levels would have contributed to the hemorrhage. The word poison hung in the air like a dropped glass. Qin Xi felt the room tilt. Her grandfather, a man who'd built a family empire, could be felled not by age alone, but by a plan. The thought made her fingers go numb. Bo Yi closed his eyes for the first time since the wedding and the crash of the projection. When he opened them, he looked at her in a way that shed some of the layers of his polish. For reasons that had nothing to do with affection yet, and everything to do with decency and justice, he said quietly, "We will find out who did this." She wanted to say it was absurd to trust the man who had offered a contract with cold hands. She wanted to say she preferred to be alone in her fight. But the hospital smelled of bleach and the metallic tang of blood, and the larger world smelled of rumor and lawyers and opportunists circling. Alone, she thought, she might be crushed. "So we start," she said instead. "We find who did it." He nodded. Not romance yet. Not even friendship. Just the first solid brick of partnership. Outside, the morning press conference began to organize itself. The family would prepare statements to placate the cameras, gratitude for the doctors, cautious optimism, a plea for privacy. But none of those words could touch the thin, chemical proof now sitting in a lab drawer. Neither could they explain the faint, purposeful edits in the hospital CCTV that suggested someone had been making sure no one saw what they shouldn't. Bo Yi dialed a number and billed it as routine, but the name on the other end was not a hospital administrator or a photographer. It was one of his lawyers, Chen Jun, who had already been pulling threads from boardrooms and courtrooms with a quiet ferocity. "Start with supply logs for the past week," Bo Yi said. "Drone the CCTV backup, trace the specific batch to the supplier and the chain of delivery, and pull financials from anyone who might gain under a change in succession." There was a small, sardonic smile at the edge of his mouth. Strategy made him less enigmatic and more dangerous. Qin Xi had always known power was an animal. Now she could see its teeth. A nurse came in with a cup of watered-down coffee. Qin Xi took it and thought, today she had signed a contract to save face. By tomorrow, she would be standing in a line of defense against an invisible argument that had tried to take her grandfather's life. Somewhere between those two things, a shaky and unlikely intimacy was forming. It was not love, it was necessity leaning toward trust. "Stick around till the courtroom," someone wrote later, a banner that would float up over the footage in another version of the story. "The twist is worth it." It was an odd, premature promise, but the ICU was not a place for promises. It was a place for facts, for evidence, for the slow unmasking. As the first formal reports began to appear online, Qin Xi watched as the public narrative tried to flatten the night into snapshots. The clickbait read, "Bride walks out, CEO steps in, a fairy tale?" It missed everything that mattered. It missed the quiet of an operating room, the grainy hunger of CCTV files, the way a prenup can become an instrument of survival. It missed the way two people, one raw with shame, one meticulous and strangely proximate, would stitch a partnership from the creases of calamity. The first day after the wedding did not end with an exhale. It ended with a plan. Tests were ordered, legal counsel had been activated. Bo Yi's team began to map out the blotches of evidence that might, with toil, form a pattern. Qin Xi, who had once measured her worth in social standing and carefully curated alliances, found a new metric forming, the willingness of someone to show up in the messy rooms. Night pressed the hospital into softer shadows, and in that dimness the two of them sat. She held her grandfather's hand for a long time. He didn't respond, but his palm was warm. Bo Yi watched her with an inscrutable expression. There was no claim of heroism, only a quiet, steadying presence. A man who, until yesterday, had been an elegant stranger at a wedding, now drawing a line in a case file. "We'll need witnesses," he said finally. "People who were in the ward, the nurses on duty, delivery records, family statements. And we should secure anything valuable at the house, jewelry, teas, documents. If someone wanted to remove evidence, they move fast. And if someone in my family is involved," her voice broke on the question. The idea had been a flicker at the back of her mind. Now it rose like smoke. Bo Yi's face hardened. "Then we treat them as adversaries," he said, "until they prove otherwise." It sounded harsh. It also sounded necessary. They had forged a contract to stop public humiliation. Now they were building a coalition against a private threat. The transition from staged spouse to strategic ally had its first practical shape: questions, lists, teams, and the slow collecting of proof. A small thing happened then, nothing cinematic, nothing ceremonious. The surgeon called from the ICU. A new batch of blood work had returned with more detailed results. There was, the surgeon said, a faint metabolite consistent with a benzodiazepine derivative. The levels were not yet conclusive. They might be a byproduct of medication. Or not. The words were careful. The implication was not. Qin Xi felt as if something inside her snapped into place. The wedding was not just a scandal anymore. It had been the opening act of a larger play, one where power, greed, and the wish to possess an inheritance all wore family faces. Bo Yi folded his hands and, for the first time that night, allowed a small, almost human vulnerability to show. "We will not let this be swept under a rug," he said. "We will not let your family be used." She looked at him and found that she believed him in that moment, not because she trusted him wholly, but because she could see, in his steadiness, the possibility of allies. She thought of her grandfather's stories and of the long list of strategic moves a family had to make to survive. The marriage had started as a shield. Now it threatened to become the hinge. They set the first terms between themselves, on a napkin taken from the hospital cafeteria and in the curt sentences of a man used to wills and clauses. He would deploy resources. She would remain in the public frame and gather what she could on the home front. They would be blunt with each other. They would not pretend to be lovers yet. They would not pretend to be friends. They would be partners in a narrower, more urgent sense, co-guardians of a legacy. When the night finally began to thin into a washed-out morning, Qin Xi stood by the window and watched the city wake. Traffic resumed like a tide. Vendors took up their carts. The world wanted its day. Inside the hospital, monitors recorded each tremor of breath. Outside of it, the marriage papers, stamped and binding, lay in her handbag like a small, contemptuous token. The camera crews would have something to chew on for weeks. But in the quiet of the ICU, reality felt smaller and sharper. The marriage had been a clean fix for a public disaster. Now it was the first piece in a larger, dangerous puzzle. On the drive back to the house, brief because there were things that could not be left unattended, Qin Xi tried to imagine the next steps. Courtrooms, poison tests, forged bills, a parade of relatives who had suddenly become interested in accounting. There would be fights at board meetings about succession. There would be whispers of emergency meetings and shareholders called in with too little notice. She thought of the blue diamond ring that used to rest on a velvet box in her drawer, proof of a different kind of value. It felt like a relic from a different person. Bo Yi's car hummed beside her in a steady beat. He did not force conversation. He allowed the silence to exist as a companionable thing. For the first time since he had offered his hand for a staged marriage, Qin Xi recognized that he was not the type of man to perform a rescue for cameras. He preferred the work behind the curtains, contract clauses, chains of custody, the legalistic kindness of proper orders. She, who had spent years sculpting a public life that could reflect perfectly in windows and along social pages, felt something unsatisfying and strangely purifying about the mess of the present. She had traded an enchanted script for a rawer one. It could have been less honorable, it could have been darker, but it was immediate, and in that immediacy there was also a kind of truth. When they reached the house, its marble steps winking in the morning light, servants moving like rehearsed staff, Qin Xi took a breath. She had been humiliated in front of hundreds. She had been thrust into a marriage that felt like the answer to someone else's problem. She had watched her grandfather collapse and had sat through the sterile hours of an operating room. She had listened to a lab tech who spoke like a liar detector and had watched a man who held both a prenup and a list of pharmacy batch numbers. If anyone had told her at the start of the day that by noon she would be forming an alliance with a CEO who wore austerity like armor, she would have laughed. But life had a way of rewiring expectations. The day had changed the terms of everything. The contract they had signed in haste would be revised into an instrument of defense. The marriage that had been a shield against gossip was now a cord connecting two people with a shared interest to find the truth and secure what mattered. As she walked up the steps, the small town car that had been her grandpa's habit, a battered sedan with a chipped hood ornament, waited in the drive. It was a humble object in a house of veneers. She ran her fingers over the chipped paint, thinking of the way power and memory accumulated in small things. In her handbag, the paper marriage certificate rustled. In her head, the lab results replayed. In the air around her, the hint of a conspiracy hovered like a shadow that refused to go away. She had moved from a scandal that could destroy a reputation to an emergency that could destroy a life. The difference was not just scale, it was moral. She opened the front door and stepped inside to a house that looked unchanged. The servants moved with a quiet efficiency. Qin Xi stood in the hallway, lips pursed, as if offended that the day had intruded on her plans. There was a polite, practiced smile on her face, one that said everything and nothing. Qin Xi met her gaze for a long, careful second. The half-sister's face was composed, practiced in the calm of someone who had always wanted more. There were things she did not know yet, which side Qin Xi would choose, how far she would go. For now, the only certainty was the press of things to do: secure the jewelry, inventory the safe, compile a list of friends of the family who had contacts with staff, and get ready for the inevitable legal storms. Bo Yi watched her move through the hallway, turning to tuck a scarf into his coat. And for the first time, Qin Xi saw a man who had chosen to enter the fray rather than dictate from afar. That choice mattered. It had nothing to do with romance, everything to do with the fact that some alliances are born of convenience and grow into something else. She closed the door, and the house absorbed her like a room in a play waiting for its next scene. The first act had ended. The audience wanted an easy story: humiliation, elegant rescue, a tidy moral. But beneath that expectation lay a narrower, more corrosive danger: deliberate tampering designed to look like accident. The realization settled over Qin Xi like a winter wind. She moved through the house with a new economy: less spectacle, more lists. Inventory the safe, photograph the jewelry, lock important papers in multiple places. Do not let anyone unaccompanied near the study. Keep a log. Bo Yi's team arrived with the punctual, quiet violence of professionals who do not announce themselves. Chen Jun carried a laptop and the kind of patience cultivated at depositions. Song Mian arrived with a stack of surveillance hard drives and a sour look that said he had seen human venality enough to be unimpressed. They did not ask if they could help. They began to act. "We'll secure chain of custody for everything you mention," Shen Jun said, voice clean. "We'll bring in an independent auditor to verify financials, and we'll put a legal freeze on any asset transfers until we can confirm signatures." Qin Xi watched him operate the way she used to watch boardroom meetings: analyze, triangulate, fold the problem into smaller, solvable parts. The competence calmed a small, tremulous corner of her. She scanned the hallway and found Qin Xi standing near the grandfather clock, as elegant as ever, as if the house were an accessory to be modeled. Qin Xi's smile did not reach her eyes. "You'll secure the safe?" Qin Xi asked quietly. Qin Xi's reply was swift and liquid. "Of course, for the family." Qin Xi let the phrase sit in the air like a painted prop. She had learned to read that smile. It had margins where ambition lived. Bo Yi remained an axis of quiet. He asked for specific items and assigned a man to tape evidence seals over drawers that had once opened without question. He made one phone call, and the security system's logs were forwarded to an encrypted server. The CCTV gaps from the hospital were pushed to the top of the list. Someone had tried to edit footage. Someone had also tried to design a narrative. Within 48 hours, the story hardened. The grandfather's hemorrhage, the weird pharmacy discrepancy, the edited CCTV clips, dots with edges that suggested contact. The lab returned fuller toxicology, metabolites consistent with a benzodiazepine derivative at low but suggestive levels. The phrase the lab used, "could be contributory under the right circumstances," was small and clinical. To Qin Xi, it sounded like accusation. Her grief bent toward anger. Even if the drug had not been the sole cause of the hemorrhage, it had been a hand on a scale already tipping toward danger. Then, as if the house were a stage where each actor had a cue, the will surfaced. The document arrived at the family lawyer's office in a black folder, its signature stamped in what some called elegant script. It named Qin Xi as primary heir and transferred trustee powers quietly to a shawl company registered under a proxy's name. The lawyer who produced the paper, anointable and oily, spoke of late-night changes made at the request of the elder. He deployed phrases meant to end debate: original on file, authenticated by notary, witnessed by 2 family friends. But not everyone accepted the neatness. Bo Yi's people requested a handwriting analysis and a forensic review of the paper. They collected stamps, matched serial numbers on the ink, and pulled from the registrar records of the time the will was allegedly signed. Discrepancies accumulated like snow. "You can falsify signatures," Chen Zhen told Qin Xi, looking at a printout where the pressure points of the signature did not align with known samples. "But it's harder to falsify the chain that led to the document existing. If there are third-party witnesses, we find them. If there are transfers tied to the will's beneficiaries, we trace them." Somewhere in the dark center of the house, motives tangled in old resentments. Qin Xi had always been better at social arithmetic: flatter the right people, offer the right smile, turn grief into opportunity. Zhou Zhenan, stripped of public face, lurked like a bad invoice, useful to some, dispensable to others. Qin Zhende, the stepfather, shaded his loyalties like a man balancing credit lines. Family had become an arena where old alliances were wagers. The first public blow came as a slow press release and a sharper private betrayal. Qin Guyu did not wake. The surgeon's measured optimism failed where biology and time defeat even the best hands. In the hours before, there had been stabilizations and hopeful monitoring. In the hours after, his breath grew shallow, monitors whispered, and the house that had been the stage of 1,000 stories closed around a coffin like a hand. The funeral was a study in controlled mourning. Cameras were permitted at the front gates. The family issued a carefully worded statement about grief and privacy. Internally, the atmosphere was less scripted. Qin Xi moved through mourners with the economy of a woman pre-accustomed to extracting advantage. She clasped hands and left her eyes in places where the press would see them, signaling a presence that read as everyday sorrow. Her body language said succession. Her whispers in hallways said contingency. Qin Xi watched the ritual, attended to the small, private requirements of those who grieved, and felt a new kind of solitude. The grief was raw and rightful, but the shadow at its edge, the possibility that the death was no accident, transformed mourning into a crucible. Documents were signed, notes were made, and the family lawyer, whose loyalty had always skewed toward those who made the most noise, began to whisper about the will. Qin Xi moved as if the victory was already in her pocket. She proffered the new will in public like a talisman, and soon the rumor took on the weight of fact. The board of the family's holding company circulated an emergency notice, a shareholders' meeting to ratify the succession. The notice was terse. The room for argument narrowed. Bo Yi did not allow the notice to stand unchallenged. He used corporate channels to call for an independent forensic audit of the will. He instructed his legal team to file an injunction delaying any transfer of power until authenticity could be established. The action was not purely altruistic. Corporate stability underpinned 1,000 other interests, and a fraudulent succession could destroy markets, unsettle investors, and collapse intertwined business deals. But there was also a sharper edge. It prevented Qin Xi from converting moral advantage into legal power. Delay is a weapon, Song Qinglu remarked to Qin Xi when they sat in the boardroom with coffee grown cold. It gives us time to gather evidence, expose fraudsters, and prepare criminal referrals. And it buys time to clear your name, Bo Yi added without looking at her, because the phrase was already understood. Reputation cannot be rebuilt after a social bastion is demolished. It must be defended preemptively.
In the background, other small dramas played out. Nurses who had worked the night Qingu Wuyu collapsed received suspicious transfers into their accounts. One day's wages multiplied in ways that did not fit the books. Phone records showed a cluster of texts exchanged between a junior nurse and a number linked to Zhao Jinan. A courier company's ledger indicated a chain of transfers from a small shell firm to a supply closet vendor that serviced the hospital's ward. The deeper they looked, the more the outline of a plan emerged. A low, deliberate choreography that had used access, money, and trust as instruments. It was the kind of plan that relied on human weak points, greed, fear, and the capacity to be bought. The auction was an odd theatrical counterattack. Bo Yi insisted they should not only prove fraud, but also reclaim public symbols that had been used as both social currency and transactional levers. The blue diamond ring, Qingu Wuyu's favorite heirloom, historically used for family ceremonies, had been removed from the safe on a night when the house's log showed an unnecessary number of visitors. The jade pendant that sat on the grandfather's dressing table had opened pathways between family members and a set of favors. An auction house in the district, a grand old building with an auctioneer in a gray suit and a crowd that liked to clink champagne glasses, became a battlefield. Items with provenance were cataloged and put under a glass lit by directional lamps. The room smelled of polished wood and quiet greed. Bo Yi arrived in a modest suit that did not scream wealth, but carried it like a tool belt. Qin Xi came with him to ensure the pendant's description was accurate. She sat at the edge of the hall, watchful. The auctioneer spoke in tones that practiced the alchemy of desire, and bids rose and fell like orchestrated waves. Qin Xi was there, a careful distance away, her expression composed. She liked auctions because they were social theater. She liked the way currency announced power. When the blue diamond went under the hammer, the air condensed. The opening bid came. The usual cluster of small players moved in, and then Bo Yi raised his paddle. His bids were sharp and clinical. The chandelier light fragmented on the faceted stone as if a small galaxy had been suspended in glass. His final bid closed with a soft tap, and the gavel didn't need to shout to make the point. He paid, not because he loved jewelry, but because courts pay attention to possession. Reclaiming the diamond was both symbol and evidence preservation, to exhibit provenance, to control narrative. The jade pendant fetched less fanfare, but it came with a curious testimony. The seller, a middleman with a guilty face, revealed under pressure that he had received it from a courier tied to a small company, one that, when traced, led to a nominee who had been shown previously to receive transfers from the same shell firm that had paid nurses. Chains tightened into loops.
The more they bought back, the more the net pulled. Bo Yi cataloged everything. Each item went into a secure evidence locker with a sealed chain of custody tag and a handwritten log kept simultaneously on a ledger and in a secure cloud. The auction house's cameras recorded them signing and locking cases. It was theater, and it was law, the public act of reclaiming legitimacy. But legal action and public acquisitions could not stop what happened at night. On one evening during the second week of the investigation, Qin Xi agreed, despite Chen Zhen's protests, to meet with a former housekeeper who claimed to have witnessed irregular deliveries. They arranged to meet at a small private room in an upscale karaoke house, something innocuous, something where voices could be private, and the memory of a conversation quickly lost. It felt like a small step toward information. Inside, the room hummed with synthetic music and the mechanical fragrance of perfumed air. The housekeeper arrived with nervous eyes, hands that kept searching for pockets. She spoke of unlikely visits at odd hours, of a delivery manifest that didn't match entries in the ledger. She was careful. She wanted nothing more than a chance to tell the truth. Someone else wanted her quiet permanently. Qin Xi remembers the suddenness like a snag on silk. A hand on the small of her back. A cup of water offered, and then a slow, disorienting fog. Voices smeared at the edges. She blinked and the room tilted. The housekeeper clutched her arm and said something about a person who would pay to make people forget. Qin Xi tried to stand and felt her legs betray her. The lights slurred into soft halos. What followed was a succession of halves, a hallway, someone's breath too close, the metallic taste of fear. Charges of assault were not detail here. What mattered was that someone tried to take away her ability to act. She struggled, fuzzing out, and then the door burst open. Bo Yi's driver, Song Mian, his voice a sharp instrument in the clouded space, hauling in a pair of firm hands that had learned to break through doors. Bo Yi appeared behind him like a shadow with a file. "You should have called us before arranging a meeting," he said, fury compressed into a sentence. He did not touch her as the initial hand had. He did not need to. He created distance. They left the karaoke room like thieves who had retrieved a prize. Qin Xi's stomach was roiled, her head full of static. She felt violated, not by what was on the surface of the crime, but by the implication that someone inside the family's orbit would move so close to silence her. That was close, Chen Zhan said afterward. And what he meant was simple. If they could drug a witness and push her out of the fight for a few hours, they could stitch doubt into testimony. If they could drug Qin Xi, the narrative would shift from her agency to her instability.
He was speaking in a voice measured by events. It had the color of a man who understood patterns. We need to assume any face-to-face rendezvous is risky. Use secure channels, don't meet alone, and if we can place surveillance on the people who delivered those packages. In the sterile safety of Bo Yi's car, Qin Xi thought about the smallness and the scale of the conspiracy. It was one thing to lose a piece of jewelry. It was another to have the ground beneath your feet shifted so carefully that you could no longer trust gravity. The attempt at silencing had become a weapon. That weapon found other forms. Days later, as their legal team prepared to present initial findings at an emergency shareholders meeting, the family's lawyer, never neutral to begin with, produced a notarized medical certificate stating Qin Xi had been experiencing severe emotional instability since the wedding night. The certificate referenced acute stress reactions and suggested a period of institutional observation. The recommendation, presented to the family with the air of paternalism, urged them to sign consent for her temporary evaluation, framed as a kindness and protection against further public episodes. The paper was dagger-sharp in its civility. Chen Zhen read it in a small conference room, and his jaw hardened. "This is not a medical record," he said. "This is a scripted performance. Somebody has arranged for a clinician to sign off on an observation that conveniently removes you from the public frame ahead of voting."
Qin Xi's anger was an animal she had learned to keep on leash, but when she went to confront the family lawyer, Qin Xi's genteel face was a portrait of sorrow. "For your own good," she said, her voice a velvet trap. "They'll keep you safe and give you time to grieve. We only want to protect you." "You're offering me protection with a note that says I'm not capable of making decisions?" Qin Xi replied. "Who signed that note? Which clinician? Where is the test? Who paid them?" The man who had handed over the medical letter had the oval face of someone used to playing small tyrannies. "We had to act quickly," he said, lips thin. "This is standard in family affairs. It's in your interest, Qin Xi." Bo Yi's presence in the hallway cut off the rest of the argument like a blade. His eyes were calm, but the decision behind them moved like a machine. "You need a proper psychiatric assessment," he said to the lawyer, "not a family attestation. An independent one, with chain of custody for any samples. And if anybody forged a medical recommendation, they will answer legally for it." That was true, and it was not enough. The lawyer's smile did not falter. He had already started whispering to other family members about the disturbance and taking the brunt for Qin Xi's public image. It was an old script: silence the inconvenient person under the guise of protection, and then let the meeting pass.
The first attempt to take Qin Xi away came during a dinner where family members had gathered, ostensibly to coordinate funeral logistics. A doctor, a man whose credentials had been vetted on paper, came in with a discreet team and attempted to persuade her to enter a private clinic for observation. The doctor's tone was low and practiced, the kind that smoothed things into best interest. He invoked tiredness, grief reactions, and the need to avoid spectacle. Qin Xi refused. She refused with the particular ferocity of someone who had been humiliated in the public square and refused to be cast aside in the private one. But the room turned on her, voices layering like a choir of convenience. Qin Xi's face was blandly appalled. The lawyer read aloud a phrase about consensus. Under stress and with the weight of the room pressing at her, her protest felt small. It should have stalled. It did not. That night, someone, unknown, masked by layers of pretense, drugged her tea back in her bedroom. It was a small vial slipped into a cup after they had left the table. She drank, intending only to swallow down the nausea of grief that sometimes arrived in the hours after the day had stretched into too many obligations. Her vision blurred. The room spun. She tried to stand and felt the floor lift like a boat. When she woke, bright daylight cut through heavy curtains. Paperwork on a bedside table declared her admission into a private psychiatric facility for observation. The form carried a familiar signature, Qin Xi's, and a lawyer's seal. The clincher was the doctor's recommendation signed the night before. Someone had produced a medical narrative that matched the will and the timetable. Remove the heiress and proceed with succession votes. But the attempt to erase her did not go unopposed. Bo Yi, who had been 2 rooms away, ensuring that the ledger for the family safe was intact, was already on his way. Chen Jun had countermanded the initial order at the hospital. His team used legal channels and corporate leverage to block immediate transfer. They had camera evidence from the house indicating which staff were in the room the night the tea was changed. They had phone logs showing a network of calls between a number linked to Zhao Zhenan and a number that had paid off a visiting clinician. It was messy, but it was enough for an injunction to be filed. That injunction called the private clinic to account publicly. A judge who owed his career to the integrity of process and who enjoyed public trust signed immediate orders to freeze Qin Xi's transfer and to demand validation of all signatures and medical notes. It was a legal check that slowed down the conspiracy. It made visible the cruelty in the room. Someone tried to weaponize psychiatry to remove a woman from the line of power.
Qin Xi did not speak of the violation in speeches. She did not post her indignation online for the world to consume. She treated it as evidence, another node to be traced. "If you can silence me with a pill and a stamp," she told Bo Yi one night as they sat in the study, "then they have already admitted a truth. They are afraid of me." He listened as if parsing a ledger. "They are not afraid of you," he said. "They are afraid of what you control. That's why they use tools that look like concern." Which meant revenge needed to be legal, precise, and public. They built their case slowly and in plain sight. Chen Zhen directed a team to compile a dossier: pharmacy shipments, CCTV timestamps, salary records, courier receipts, bank transfers. Song Mian tracked a cluster of shell companies. Song Qianlu worked the angles of corporate procedure: how to call a special shareholders meeting, how to issue an injunction without giving the other side a pretext for claiming harassment. Evidence emerged like punctuation marks. A supplier's shipping manifest revealed a mislabeled box with a canceled batch number. A courier, under pressure, testified that he had taken packages directly to a nurse at the hospital and that the payment trail had run through a nominee company whose director had been linked to Zhou Zhenan in social registers. A nursing assistant who had been bribed with small sums and the promise of work came forward when confronted with bank transfers and the threat of criminal liability. She told a story of being paid to make sure the elderly gentlemen sleep and to help with distress. Her voice trembled, but the chain of emails and the transfers confirmed what she said. At the same time, Chen Zhen worked with handwriting experts and forensic accountants. The will's ink, under spectral analysis, revealed splotches inconsistent with an original signature. The registrar's clerk who had certified the will later admitted she had been handed a printed form and told it was a scanned copy to be officially recognized. She had not been allowed to inspect the signatures in person. The web of deceit had multiple hands. The shareholders' meeting that Qin Xi had assumed would crown her ascension was delayed, then postponed, then called into question publicly. Bo Yi did not simply delay, he framed the narrative. A respected, independent law firm was asked to review the will, auditors took custody of the document, and a criminal referral for fraud and tampering was filed with the prosecutors. The tactic was surgical: bring the law into the light so the conspirators could not hide behind family prerogative. The prosecution moved with caution, which in itself felt like justice. It meant the weight of evidence was enough to sustain charges. But it also meant a public trial could be called, that the names of those who had orchestrated the campaign, Zhou Zhenan, Qin Xi, possibly Qin Zhengde, would be aired. That airing terrified them. It also energized public opinion in Qin Xi's favor. The more they tried to shame her, the more credence her competency received. A woman who fought in the open was better than one silenced behind the curtains. Then came a theft of documents, an audacious attempt to erase records. In the dead of night, someone infiltrated the family's office and tried to remove the ledger containing the corporate minutes, the originals of letters, and the log of visitors. The intruder was clumsy enough to trigger an alarm. Security footage, retrieved from a backup Bo Yi had insisted on, showed a figure in a hooded jacket moving through a corridor, hands pushing open drawers. The figure halted at the safe, but was distracted by the sound of a car. The footage was grainy, but telling. The intruder's finger left a smear on a brass handle that forensic teams could lift and turn into DNA. They had their man, a hired thief with links to an operative who sometimes acted as a bagman for payments. Under pressure and facing a serious sentence, he spoke. Zhou Jianan had been the one to arrange the night delivery and had used the thief to remove documents to make it look like family negligence.
The thief's testimony stitched a thread between the hospital tampering and the plot to rush succession. Court filings swelled. The indictment accused Qin Xi and Zhou Jianan of conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery of documents, tampering with medical records, and bribery. Qin Zhengde's role was less clear. He had been in the periphery, conveniently ambiguous in loyalty, and this opacity would be a narrative in the courtroom to test. The courtroom atmosphere the day the charges were read was like a coiled spring. Cameras lined the hall. It felt like the city watched reconciliation and ruin in equal measure. Qin Xi entered with Bo Yi at her side, not as an ornament, but as a man with a stack of sealed evidence folders. The press had long since spun its versions of the story, tales of wicked half-sisters and betrayed brides, but the courtroom had its own slower laws: chain of custody, witness testimony, cross-examination. It was a stage for people who had specialized in fast money to be undone by the patient work of truth. The prosecution called witnesses in an order designed to show not just the act, but the method. The hospital lab tech, refreshingly honest, a man who had once told a colleague he hated cover-ups, testified about the oddities in the meds. He explained the batch numbers and the reconciliation process in plain terms that the jury could sense as true. The nursing assistant, eyes down, described how she had been approached and paid small amounts to leave doors unlocked and to misreport medication logs. She spoke of fear, of threats, of the weight of money. She cried at times. The jury watched and recorded. Then the forensic accountant took the stand. He displayed bank transfers that read like the root map of a crime. Small sums moved through nominees and offshore circuits, then wired to accounts used to pay certain hospital staff.
He projected screenshots of messages, the ones the thief had referenced, between Zhou Jianan and a middleman, where the businessman's tone was transactional and chilling. Chen Zhen cross-examined with the economy of someone who had spent his life tearing apart perfunctory stories. When he asked the courier whether he had ever been paid by Qin Xi directly, the man's hesitant answer made a new crack. When the handwriting expert placed the will under magnification and showed the trial that the pressure points did not match Qin Gowu's known hand, it added to the pile. But it was not just the forensics that mattered. It was the human moment, a recorded conversation that had been recovered from a scrubbed phone, a voice, Zhou Jianan's, laughing about making sure the old man sleeps through the night, and then going cold when told the plan needed to be more discreet. The tape was clipped, authenticated, and played. In the sealed hush of the court, some people shifted. The sound of the laughter felt grotesque. Qin Xi took the stand once accusations made her unavoidable. Her face was painted with the practiced calm of someone skilled in crisis PR. Her answers were measured. She told the court she had been grieving, that she had feared for the company's stability, that any document she had relied upon had been presented to her in good faith. The defense tried to cast her as a woman victimized by circumstance. Chen Zhen's cross-examination was clinical. He produced messages on a phone recovered from a middleman where Qin Xi thanked the courier for handling things discreetly. Her face made a small shift at the accusation. The jury watched the micro-expression like a compass. Zhou Jianan's testimony was a mix of deflection and bluster. At one point, under the pressure of evidence and the force of phone records, he stammered and admitted to payments for logistics. The word sounded pale in a room that wanted to name the thing those logistics had enabled. A month of trial condensed into a day of revelation. The judge listened, the jury absorbed, and the law did its slow work. In the end, the weight of evidence, bank transfers, recovered CCTV snippets, confessions, forensic ink analysis, and the testimony of coerced staff made the narrative coherent, a conspiracy to expedite succession through manipulation of medical events and forged documents. The court found guilt where the evidence indicated malice. The verdicts were definitive enough to topple some careers and to seal others in disgrace. Zhou Jianan received a sentence that matched the gravity of his transactions. Qin Xi was convicted of fraud and conspiracy. Qin Zhengde avoided a criminal conviction but not public ruin. His complicity in certain administrative acts cost him his position in the family company. The court also ordered a full audit of the family's transactions and a review of hospital practices connected to the case. The courtroom catharsis was not the end of pain.
Jinling funerals leave a residue of small things: thick tea in porcelain cups, fingerprints in dust, and Qin Guoyu's absence settled into the house like a new tenant. His funeral had already happened. Now the posthumous accounting determined how his legacy would be stewarded. Qin Xi felt both vindicated and empty. The man she had loved was gone. Justice felt functional in the way a hospital's machinery functions: necessary, precise, but not suited to fill holes made by grief. Yet vindication shifted the axis of power. The board of the holding company, under public pressure and with legal foundations reinforced by the court's findings, confirmed Qin Xi as the deputy manager. The shareholders' meeting that had been intended to demote her into silence instead handed her a mandate. The choice was not purely sentimental. The company needed someone who could negotiate reputation repair, orchestrate strategic alliances, and steer the firm back into investor confidence. Qin Xi had been forged in the public crucible. She had become, unwillingly, the most credible steward of the family interest. Her first day in the office as deputy manager was brisk and concrete. She wore a dark suit that did not advertise mourning; it announced competence. The staff lined up with expressions that ranged from reverent to cynical. She had a binder of priorities: restore supply contracts, audit charitable foundations, and stabilize the corporate image. She had a list of personnel matters that needed attention. She had a team that had watched the House of Family Empire metamorphose into a courtroom. Bo Yi's presence shifted in a way that matched the nature of the new role. He did not take over, he did not instruct. He stood beside her with a particular kind of steadiness, offering counsel when asked and strategic patience when not. He had helped piece together the forensic trails that led to conviction, but in the corporate arena, he was careful to let Qin Xi lead. The image was important. The world needed to see a woman who could stand and steward the house that had once nearly devoured her. The moments that stitched together the romance were small and deliberate. Their intimacy grew not from grand private declarations, but from the accumulation of acts. Bo Yi reading a budget late into the night because Qin Xi requested a second set of eyes. Qin Xi pausing to prepare coffee and finding that Bo Yi already had the board notes annotated. A shared cigarette on the balcony where neither spoke much, but both felt the heat of presence. The transactional language of their marriage, 1 year, a public performance, morphed into a different dialect: mutual aid, shared strategy, and personal care. Where Bo Yi had been measured and reserved, cracks of vulnerability began to show in private. He spoke one evening about his father, who had taught him to beware of theatrics and to value competency. He described a world where power demanded that one never make investments in sentiment without calculations. Qin Xi listened, not to argue, but to understand the architecture that had shaped the man beside her. She did not seek to dismantle his reserve. She learned to read the small signs when he was tired or when he wanted to be trusted. There were tender interludes, rare, unadvertised things. Once, standing in the empty office after a board meeting where they had defended a controversial restructuring, Bo Yi unfolded a small stack of letters he had found in Qin Guoyu's desk. They were business correspondences and small personal notes. One was an old photograph of a younger Qin Guoyu beside a cramped shop counter. The two of them read the handwriting and laughed at a line where the grandfather had mused about risk and patience.
"Your people have a way with paper," Qin Xi said, smiling. "They think they can hide in ink." "Paper remembers," Bo Yi said softly. "People forget." That night, for the first time since the wedding, Qin Xi allowed herself to be held for longer than protocol. The gesture was careful and unspoken. It was trust built from degrees of action. Little things mattered. He remembered her coffee preference. He checked her inbox to make sure nothing had been overlooked before she slept. He sent a message that said simply, "I'll be in the office if you need anything." She replied with a short, dry joke. The exchange felt like a private treaty. Not all reconciliations were complete. Qin Xi's conviction left an afterimage of bitterness. She was charged and sentenced. The public regarded her with a mix of scorn and fascination. The family fractured along lines that would take years to mend, if ever. Qin Zhengde retreated into a quiet exile of sorts, his name still associated with certain accounts, but his influence reduced. The household staff, those implicated, lost their jobs, and some faced legal consequences. The consequences were real, and in that reality, Qin Xi found a bone-deep exhaustion. But professional triumph offered a different currency. Under Qin Xi's leadership, the company stabilized. She restructured a flailing division, negotiated an alliance that shored up investor confidence, and initiated a corporate social responsibility campaign that felt less performative and more reconciliatory. Propaganda and narrative were useful tools when truth had teeth. She wielded them with a measured hand. The public sometimes misread romantic texture as Hollywood gloss. They painted the two of them, Qin Xi and Bo Yi, as a myth. Scandal married the hero. But the truth was slower and less glamorous. Their late nights at the office were filled with spreadsheets and conference calls. Their shared mornings were quiet and domestic in a way that had nothing to do with public performances. They had been bound by a contract, and then, unexpectedly, by a series of choices that kept showing up for each other. The day the conviction was finalized and the company's annual report posted a clean audit, they marked it with something both private and small. They walked through the old family garden in the late afternoon when the light was thin and forgiving. Flower beds that had once been meticulously organized now showed the honest mess of grieving seasons. Qin Xi stopped by a small stone bench near an old ginkgo tree and sat. Bo Yi took out a paper bag and placed it beside her. "What's in there?" she asked, amused. "Nothing dramatic," he said. "Coffee and 2, if you want, sandwiches." They ate in silence for a while, which felt more intimate than a conversation. Then Qin Xi took his hand and squeezed it in a way that said, without a single word, "Thank you." He looked at her and, with that minimal movement he had mastered, drew her in for a brief, deliberate kiss, one that tasted of coffee and the dust of effort. The seasons turned as they do. The company regained footing. The public's appetite for melodrama softened into a new appreciation for a woman who, having been humiliated publicly, had carried grief into action and rebuilt. She was a figure who could be cliché in the hands of gossip, but real in board minutes and bank statements. Their marriage clock, initially set for a year, was not renegotiated with legal haste, but with mutual recognition. One afternoon in the boardroom, after a particularly brutal day of negotiations, Qin Xi closed her laptop and looked at Bo Yi across the table. "I signed because I had to," she said, "but I want something real after this." He considered the phrase as if it were a balance sheet. "What does real look like to you?" he asked, because he wanted to be precise as well as vulnerable. She laughed, that sound now a familiar instrument. "For starters, you being in the office because you choose to be, not to keep me visible, and that you let me see your softer parts without thinking they're liabilities." He purchased silence for a heartbeat and then answered with the practical tenderness that had become his language. I will remain because this matters to you, to the company, and I will show you the softer parts when I see them. Months later, during a shareholders' gala meant both to celebrate financial recovery and to close a bruising chapter, Qin Xi and Bo Yi stood together under warm lights. A camera caught them mid-conversation, and the headline favored its myth-making. But for them, the moment was ordinary in a new way, a shared understanding that they had been forged together in crisis and had chosen, in the aftermath, to remain. The epilogue unfolded not in a single cinematic rush, but in modest gestures that indicated continuance. Qin Xi walked through the renovated office and pinned a printed email from the hospital, thanking the company for its reform proposals, an initiative she had pushed that improved supply chain verification had since reduced similar incidents elsewhere.
A plaque in the lobby acknowledged Qin Guoyu's contributions in a measured, respectful way. Qin Xi had been sentenced, served a term, and then moved into a quieter, constrained life. Some family ties were broken, and some gradually repaired over phone calls that remained clotted with awkwardness. One late autumn evening, with the city lights like distant constellations, they sat in a small kitchen in the company apartment and drank plain tea. Sometimes the romance reads like a crescendo: scandal, rescue, trial, victory, wedding. But it had landed differently for them. Trust built by actions, not by declarations. Tenderness that grew from sustained mutual protection and respect for the other's agency. Qin Xi placed her hand on her stomach absent-mindedly and laughed, a private, sly sound. I heard someone say once that the earliest alliances are forged in need, she said. Bo Yi looked at the place where her fingers rested, and his eyes softened in a way that belonged to private rooms. He reached across and covered her hand with his. Alliances mature, he said, and sometimes they surprise you. He was not boastful, he did not get sentimental, he simply allowed a small, private smile to bloom. The future had been hard-bought, the present was fragile and guarded, but within that guardedness there was a warmth that felt like hope. As the series of events that had begun with a ruined wedding and run through operating rooms and courtrooms finally softened into the mundane shape of everyday life, the public's appetite for sensational headlines dimmed. People who had once come to watch the spectacle left with the impression that real rescue is quieter and that power, when wielded well, can be a shield rather than a sword. At the company's next strategic summit, Qin Xi opened with a line that could have been a slogan or a truth. We will run this business in a way that makes the world safer for those who must trust us. The shareholders applauded. Bo Yi, seated in the audience of the room he helped to study, watched her with the kind of pride that did not need to be spoken. One evening, months after the verdict, as they walked through a private garden whose paths were newly mended, a neighbor, a woman who ran a small boutique nearby, crossed them and offered a thin paper envelope with a small cake tucked inside. "Congratulations," she said, "for everything." Inside the card was a single line: "We saw you. Keep going." They accepted it with the modesty of people who had been seen for what they were, not caricatures, but individuals who had chosen to act. Bo Yi took Qin Xi's hand and, in a small, unpublicized gesture, kissed her palm. The gesture was neither dramatic nor performative. It was private and precise. Later that night, long after the cameras had packed up and the pending suits had been filed, Qin Xi and Bo Yi sat on the couch and watched the city skyline. There had been blood and legal depositions, tears, and strategic moves. There had been acts of courage and the small business of loving someone in all the ways that made them human, showing up, listening, staying. The marriage that had begun as a contract of convenience had turned, with time and evidence and shared nights, into something more solid, partnership informed by affection. Neither of them pretended the future would be simple.
The world had a tendency to complicate even the best-laid plans. But they had learned how to build safeguards and how to turn transparency into armor. Qin Xi had learned to wield power in a new register, less social performance, more responsibility, and Bo Yi had learned the value of being consistent in the small things. In the quiet, he murmured, we started from chaos. She smiled, the kind of smile that carried its own small history. From chaos to something like order, from strangers to something like home. He tapped the one-year clause in his head like an old contract and then set it down. We'll decide the rest when it comes, he said. They did not make public promises about forever. They did not need to. The city glittered, and their private room contained the evidence of fights fought and won, of a family partially healed, and of a relationship that had grown out of necessity into genuine affection. A week later, at a small dinner with core team members to celebrate the structural reforms the company had passed, someone raised a toast. Bo Yi and Qin Xi stood in the middle of the table's circle. The room clapped. The applause was genuine. Qin Xi looked at the people who had stood with her, the lawyers, the associates, the old surgeon who had been honest, and felt a grounding warmth. When they stepped outside later, the air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. Bo Yi drew them close, and with the kind of casual confidence that no longer felt like an armor, touched a hand to her belly in a gesture that was small and private and playful. A near whisper between them, a hint, not a headline. Perhaps possibility. Perhaps simply the comfort of two people who had chosen to fight together. The city kept humming, and their life, no longer defined by scandal alone, moved forward. Ownership changed hands in the ledger, reputations were mended by work and transparency, and a CEO romance that had begun as a social gambit deepened into a partnership built on mutual protection, competence, and the slow accrual of trust. If the world expected a fairy tale, it got something better. A story of survival, legal reckoning, and an alliance that was chosen again and again. From the chaos of a wedding night to a romance forged in boardrooms and hospital corridors, Qin Xi's life had been rewritten, not as spectacle, but as testament to the fact that dignity can be reclaimed, that justice can be pursued, and that love, when it grows from action and respect, can feel both surprising and inevitable. If you stuck around for the courtroom, you know the twist was worth it. If you loved the arc from scandal to strength, subscribe for more stories where ordinary people turn crisis into power and fragile alliances become true partnerships.